I took my coworkers out for drinks, only to realize I didn't have enough money to cover the tab. Desperate, I walked up to the hottest guy in the VIP booth. "Hey, can you pay this for me? I'll Venmo you later." The guy tried to play it cool. "Miss, do we know each other?" I snatched the drink right out of his hand. "We don't. But ask your bodyguard how many times he's called me for a favor. I've saved your ass enough times. Can't you return the favor once?" The bodyguard immediately covered his face with his hand and confirmed everything, which I appreciated because I had absolutely been prepared to describe the toilet bowl incident in full detail to a VIP booth of strangers if necessary. Luke Vance's friends leaned forward with the collective energy of people who had just been told a myth might be real. They explained the phenomenon to me as though I hadn't already lived it 6 times. When Luke drank, he became something between a feral animal and a force of nature, attacking anyone who came within reach, having once nearly snapped someone's arm in half, and having sent another person to the hospital for 2 months with multiple fractures. The doctor's diagnosis was hyperdefensive instinct, a clinical way of saying his subconscious trusted nobody when his inhibitions were down and acted accordingly. What made me special, they wanted to know. I raised an eyebrow and pulled out my phone with my QR code. "Transfer me $500 first and I'll give you a show." Someone actually did it immediately. I heard the payment notification, pocketed the money, told them to get him wasted and come find me, and walked back to the bar to pay my tab while the booth erupted behind me. I want to be clear about something. Luke Vance, sitting in that VIP booth in a suit that cost more than my monthly rent, radiating the particular energy of a man who had never once in his adult life been told no, was a complete fraud. I had seen him use a city bike as a blanket. I had photos. The photos were not flattering. The gap between the man on the asphalt and the man in the booth was so large it was almost impressive, like watching someone perform a character they'd invented entirely from scratch and had been playing so long they'd forgotten it was a performance. I found this deeply funny in a way I had never been able to fully explain to anyone. It had started 6 months ago on a Tuesday night, when I was leaving work late and found him sprawled in the middle of the street, fully unconscious, using a city bike as both mattress and blanket, muttering about being thirsty. I was terminally online and the scene was objectively hilarious, so I took a video. Then I got closer and registered the face, which was even slack with unconsciousness and reeking of alcohol. Genuinely unfair in its construction. I gave him water from my bottle, which he accepted with the surprising obedience of a very large, very drunk toddler. When he showed no signs of becoming mobile, I went through his phone. Face ID worked perfectly, extremely easy when they're asleep, and FaceTimed the first contact on his list. I pointed the camera at his face and explained the situation. The person on the other end did not ask for a location. He screamed at me to back away 5 feet immediately, which I found dramatic, and then threatened my life, which I found deranged. And then I hung up and sat on the curb to wait because I was not going to leave an unconscious person in the street regardless of how unhinged his friends were. He relocated his head to my thigh and slept like he had been personally guaranteed safety there, which he had not, but which his subconscious had apparently decided on its own authority. The friend arrived in 10 minutes and looked at the scene, Luke asleep on my leg, me eating a granola bar I'd found in my bag, the city bike still functioning as ambient furniture, with the expression of a man encountering something that violated his understanding of physics. He introduced himself as Marco, Luke's head of security, and told me with the careful tone of someone delivering medical information that what I had just done was statistically impossible. I said I had simply given him water and sat down, which was not particularly heroic. Marco said I didn't understand that the last person who had tried to approach Luke in that state had ended up with a dislocated shoulder, and that he had never once in 4 years of doing this job seen Luke allow anyone to touch him when he was drunk. I looked down at Luke, who had now fully wrapped an arm around my knee in his sleep. I said, "Well, he seems fine." Marco took approximately 40 photos on his phone before he woke Luke up. I assumed that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. 3 weeks later, Marco called me at 11:30 at night and said, Luke had gotten out of a work event extremely drunk and was in a hotel hallway, refusing to go to his room, and had already thrown a house phone at the wall and was threatening the furniture. He said he had tried everything. He said, "Is there any chance?" I said I was in my pajamas. He said he would send a car immediately. I said the car better have good seats, It did. I arrived at the hotel, walked down the hallway, said hey, and Luke looked up from the floor where he was sitting with his back against the wall and said oh and got up and went to his room. Marco stood behind me in complete silence for a moment and then said, I've been doing this for 4 years. I said, I think he just needs someone who isn't scared of him. Marco said, everyone is scared of him. I said, I've seen him use a city bike as a blanket. It's very hard to be scared of someone after that. Marco sent me $500 as a thank you. I tried to refuse. He said Luke had pre-authorized emergency response payments and this absolutely qualified. It happened 4 more times after that. Always late, always Marco calling with the particular exhausted desperation of a man who has tried every other option first. Always a car with good seats. Always Luke being inexplicably calm the moment I showed up and inexplicably cooperative in a way he apparently wasn't with anyone else on earth. I started keeping a running tab of favors in my head, partly as a joke and partly because Luke Vance was beginning to cost me sleep, and I felt that ought to be worth something. I had never spoken to him sober. He had never spoken to me at all, technically. Drunk Luke operated on instinct, and apparently his instinct was to accept my presence without question. But sober Luke had no memory of any of it and no framework for who I was. Which was why, when I walked up to his VIP booth and asked him to cover my tab, he had looked at me like a stranger. Because to him, I paid the bill and sent my coworkers home and walked back to the booth to deliver the show I'd been paid $500 for. I found Luke's friends enthusiastically trying to pour drinks into him and Luke not cooperating at all. Which was interesting. He was watching the door, I realized. He had been watching for me. The moment I appeared, he stood up, grabbed my wrist with the decisive grip of a man who had made a decision, and pulled me out of the club and into the back of a Maybach before I had fully processed what was happening. The door shut hard enough to shake the frame. I rubbed my nose and told him it wasn't my fault. He only trusted me when he was drunk and that it was annoying for me too. He looked at me in the dark of the back seat with the particular intensity of a sober man trying to locate something he could only access when he wasn't, and said nothing for long enough that the silence became its own kind of conversation. Then he said, Marco showed me the photos. I said, which ones? He said, all of them. The street. The hotel hallway. The time at the fundraiser. I said, the fundraiser one is my favorite. You were very committed to that potted plant. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. He said, why did you keep coming? I said, Marco asked and the cars had good seats. He said, that's not a reason. I said, also I couldn't sleep knowing you were somewhere being a menace to hotel furniture. He was quiet again. Outside the Maybach the city moved past and the club lights receded and the night had the particular quality of a conversation happening slightly outside of normal time, the way important things often do. He said, I don't remember any of it. I said, I know. He said, but I apparently trust you completely when I'm drunk. I said, your subconscious has better judgment than the rest of you. He looked at me for a long moment and then said, I'd like to fix that. I said, fix what? He said, the part where I only trust you when I'm not myself. I'd like to know you when I am. I looked at him. The comic book face, the careful eyes, the man who had slept on my thigh on a city street and accepted water from a stranger and built a mythology of untouchability that his own unconscious kept quietly dismantling every time I showed up. I thought about the $500 in my phone and the photos I definitely still had and the 4 late nights I had spent being the only person he would let close, and I thought that was probably already knowing someone in the ways that counted. I said, you should probably start by buying me dinner. He said, I already told Marco to make a reservation. I said, you were very confident I'd say yes. He said, my subconscious has better judgment than the rest of me. I laughed loud enough that the driver glanced in the rearview mirror. Outside the window the city was bright, and the night was young, and somewhere behind us Marco was presumably dealing with a VIP booth of very disappointed men who had paid $500 for a show they were not going to get, and I found I had absolutely no regrets about that whatsoever.